God's people were one day in Egypt, and all of a sudden Pharaoh died. And a new Pharaoh came on board who did not know God's people, and it became hardship and pain in a wilderness experience. And God saw the pain of God's people, and he sent a man named Moses to bring God's people out of Egypt. God's people were in Egypt. They went through a water crossing. They parted the Red Sea. Cecil B. DeMille's, those of you who saw that movie will see this great mass of water being parted. God's people went through the water out into the wilderness. And it is there, pardon my French, that God's people bitched and complained about every possible thing they could think of. And it was out in the wilderness that God's people became disobedient and unfaithful to God. Matthew wants us to see Jesus as the new Israel. It is only in Matthew's gospel that Jesus goes to Egypt, because that's where Israel went. Jesus goes to Egypt. He, like Israel before him, goes through a water crossing. It's called baptism. We'll talk about that in a minute. Jesus goes out into the wilderness where God's people were tempted, and Jesus was obedient the way God's people were disobedient. Matthew wants us to understand that of the three temptations that the devil tempted Jesus with in Matthew's gospel, all three of those temptations Israel was tempted with in the wilderness, and in exactly the same order. So it is Jesus who retraces their steps for each of us. Okay, before we start with chapter 4, let's remember the last verse of chapter 3. Jesus has just been baptized, and God's voice comes from the cloud. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. In Jesus' baptism, God announces his identity. Jesus Christ as the Son of the living God. In the wilderness story to follow, that identity is put to the test. And it is a painful test indeed. Read along with me for a couple of verses in chapter 4. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He lasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was hungry. I guess so. How many of you have ever fasted for anything other than dietary reasons? How many of you made it longer than one day? Longer than 3 days? Longer than 5 days? Longer than 7 days? Ron, how long did you make it? 21 days. Jesus fasted, count them, 40 days. Do you think he was hungry? Do you think he was vulnerable? Do you think he was at his weakest point when the devil came and said to Jesus, "Would you turn those stones to bread so that you can eat?" When I was in seminary, a second-year seminarian all those years ago, Dick Thulin in preaching class said something, some of you know this story, that has haunted me about this text ever since. Dick Thulin asked the question, when the devil came to tempt Jesus, what did he look like? As a second-year seminary student, I fell for it. He looked like a red being with a horned tail and Dick Thulin asked me and the rest of our class, then how could the devil tempt Jesus if he looked like the devil? Then Dick Thulin said, when the devil asked Jesus to turn these stones to bread, is it possible that he looked like a starving child? How does the devil come disguised to you? I remember the Mad Magazine article in the 60s. Some of you are old enough to remember the 60s. Santa Claus coming down the chimney. And to mom, he gives a fur coat. And to dad, he gives a new car. And to son, he gives a PlayStation, however many PlayStations there are. And then Santa Claus goes up the chimney, takes off his Santa Claus, and he's the devil underneath. How does the devil tempt you? I have a feeling that if the devil wants to tempt Dave Helfrich, the devil will never come to Dave Helfrich and say, if you fall down and worship me, I will make you bishop of the Southeastern Synod. I have neither the skill set nor the interest to become bishop. But Dave, have you noticed that red Ferrari? The devil is good at disguises. It's a tough wilderness out there. Let's take a look at the second. So the first of these temptations, food. Remember Israel, manna in the wilderness? Here Jesus, bread in the wilderness. The second temptation starts with verse 5. Since you are the Son of God, throw yourself down and test God. For it is written, God will bring his angels to take care of you. And Jesus said no. Because what Jesus realized is if he did that, it would change the relationship that God had with God's people. Our job is to follow God, not have God follow us. And if I test God, who's in control of that relationship? Me. Rather than the God who calls me to allow God to be in charge of my relationship.